Sewing is a very personal hobby and something that we usually do alone in the privacy of our own home, just us and our trusted sewing machine. So sometimes we may look around and notice that we are doing something very different than other sewists do. So here are 5 things that I do differently, and these are my unpopular sewing opinions. Starting with number 1, and this may shock some of you, but I don't use seam ripper. And it's not because I don't make mistakes. I do quite a few of them, but I just don't like the tool itself. For some reason, this tool is something I never grew to like and use often, even though I have quite a few of these, because they always come with the sewing machines, and I have been gifted quite a few of them over the years. Instead of the seam ripper, I prefer using either clippers, small embroidery scissors, these are usually my favorite ones to use, or if I have to unpick a very delicate seam, I just like to go in with a pin and go 1 stitch by 1 stitch and unpick it that way. In fact, it's only when I started using social media for sewing purposes is when I noticed how popular seam ripper is, and this is something that I just never used. So even though I know that using seam ripper is popular, it's just something that never grew on me, and I prefer using other tools instead and get same good results. My unpopular opinion number 2 is I cannot hand sew without a thimble. Now this needs a little bit backstory, because when I started sewing, I didn't use a thimble and I thought it just something completely unnecessary. However, when I enrolled into sewing school, the first day my teacher said, "Julie, you have to get a thimble." And at first I wanted to go ahead, but I never used a thimble. But then I figured, because I'm enrolled in sewing school, I'm going to listen to my teacher and at least give the thimble a try. So I went to the store, bought a thimble for like €1 because they're very, very cheap. And now I cannot sew with hands without one. And in fact, over the years, I got so used to it that now even if I have to base stitch like a very short seam, I am still grabbing my trusted thimble. And yes, I still use the same old €1 thimble that I bought all those years ago. So the thimble protects the finger and it helps push the needle, especially when working with hard fabrics or sewing through multiple layers by hand. However, I also understand one reason why this tool may not be as popular is because I actually wear very, very short nails. I never enjoyed wearing long nails. I love long nails on other people, but I personally can't do anything with long nails, so I always keep them very, very short. And because of that, for me, wearing a thimble is very, very convenient, which I understand may not be the case for people who enjoy wearing longer nails. I know that thimble is not a very popular item, because if I post something on Instagram, for example, where I show that I'm hand sewing and I use a thimble, I will get at least one comment asking what's that thing on my finger. But I absolutely love using it. It helps so much, especially when sewing through bulky seams, through thick fabrics. So if this is something that you struggle with, you may be interested in trying thimble as well. My unpopular sewing opinion number 3 is I feel very lukewarm about pockets in dresses and skirts. I love pockets in pants, but for dresses and skirts, and I don't have like a very good reasoning why. Maybe sometimes I feel that it can ruin the silhouette of the garment. And basically, when I'm wearing a dress, even if it's a store-bought dress that does already have pockets, I will very rarely use it, because when I'm wearing a dress, I simply don't like putting items in my pockets. Which is not the case when I'm wearing pants, and for some reason when I'm wearing pants, I want to keep everything in the pockets. So I see very often on social media that pockets are loved and enjoyed, but for me personally, on dresses or skirts, they're not always needed. Before we move to next unpopular opinion, I just wanted to mention that I am working on new video about the biggest sewing myths. So if you know a sewing myth that you hear very often, leave it in the comments. I would love to include it in the video as well. Thank you for sharing your experience in the comment. The comment section is always my favorite part about the video. So thank you so much who are commenting the video. That always makes my day. Now let's move on to unpopular opinion number 4, and it's I don't like sew-in labels. So while I've seen gorgeous handmade labels sewn into the garments, this is something I never done. And the reason for that is very simple. I don't like feeling the label in the inside of the garment. In fact, I don't like it so much that when I buy garment in store, I bring it home. The number one thing that I do is remove all labels from the inside of the garment. And yes, it does cause quite a few problems later on if I need to do a special treatment on a garment and I cut away care label and I don't know how to do it. So that does create extra problems, but I simply cannot wear a garment if it has a label inside of it. And this is why I never add labels to my garments. However, I did see the iron-on labels and custom-made iron-on labels, and I actually want to give those labels a try. For one thing, I want to clean out my closet, and I have a lot of handmade items, and I think it would be like very interesting to mark them on and note who made the garment, maybe when I made the garment, so that when the next person gets the garment, they can see who made it and a little bit of the history of the garment. And also I like sewing for my son, and when I make him toddler or baby clothes and I don't mark the exact size, it's later very confusing, especially if I want to donate or store those garments for the future. So while I absolutely see the purpose behind these sew-in labels, especially if it's for marking sizing or just marking who created the garment, this is something I don't use, but again, I might change this opinion in the future when I try the iron-on labels. Fifth and final unpopular sewing opinion is I actually love patterns without seam allowance. Now, I understand that having a pattern with seam allowance is very convenient for cutting. However, it's very rarely that I take a ready-made pattern and just go ahead cut it without making adjustments for my figure. And when you need to make adjustments for your figure, when you need to match your body measurements to the garment measurements, it's much more convenient to do that on a pattern without seam allowance. Now, I also have to mention that I started sewing, and I have been sewing for many years using Burda magazine patterns, and those patterns do not have seam allowance. This is probably the reason why I got so used to working without seam allowance and adding seam allowance myself manually. But I also understand that a lot of sewists do enjoy having seam allowance already included in the pattern. This is why in my patterns, in my sewing patterns, I always include 2 lines for each size. One is without seam allowance and the other one with included seam allowance. Personally, I think that this is the best method because you can see what size of seam allowance is included in which part, because if you're sewing close to the curves like neckline, armhole, the seam allowance has to be smaller than, let's say, on straight seams like shoulder. With seam allowance and without seam allowance on the pattern, I think solves a lot of that confusion. Here I also want to mention that you always have to check the pattern instructions, read them carefully and see whether the pattern includes the seam allowance or not. So one example is I recently made a pair of pants for my toddler, and I was making them using a sewing pattern magazine which does not have included seam allowance. However, when I cut the pattern, I noticed that the legs are very long and they look abnormally long. But when I flipped to the beginning of the magazine for general sewing instructions, it mentioned that patterns do not include seam allowance, but they do include hem fold allowance. So this is why when I cut out that pattern, the leg part looked abnormally long, simply because I didn't know that the hem allowance was already included while the seam allowance was not. So yeah, I was confused even after all these years of sewing, which is a good example while you always want to read thoroughly all the instructions around the pattern that you're working on. So here are all of my unpopular sewing opinions, and even though they're not popular, they still allow me to get good results. I'm interested to hear what is the thing that you do that you know is not popular, so please share it in the comment section below. Thank you for watching today's video, and I will see you next time. Bye!